Imagine you're navigating this treacherous, winding highway in the dead of night. You're making phenomenal time, right? The engine is just humming, the radio's playing your favorite song. The illusion of total control is absolute. But then, completely without warning, the dashboard simply dies.
Oh, wow. Just goes black.
Completely black. The speedometer, the fuel gauge, the engine temperature readout, every single metric you rely on just vanishes into the darkness.
That is a profoundly terrifying state of affairs. Because, I mean, the momentum hasn't stopped, right?
Exactly.
The vehicle is still hurtling forward at, 70 miles an hour, but you have been violently disconnected from the physical reality of the machine.
Yeah.
You literally no longer know what is happening under the hood.
You are completely blind. And in that blindness, you, the driver, are forced to rely on pure intuition. You're like listening for a rattle, smelling for burning rubber, guessing at your velocity based on the wind.
Which is a terrible way to drive.
Right. You don't actually know the engine is overheating until smoke is violently pouring through the air vents. And at that point, you haven't just lost a gauge, you've cracked the engine block.
The catastrophic failure has already occurred.
Exactly. So I want you, the listener sitting here with us right now, to keep that visceral feeling of driving blind in mind today, because we are cracking open a really fascinating stack of historical and contemporary records to examine what happens when an entire industrialized nation operates without a dashboard.
Yeah. We are looking at the origin story of modern environmental protection. And I have to say, digging into these sources, we've got EPA archive records, Columbia Law School analyses, and this incredibly detailed dossier called Storm Warning. The historical reality completely subverts the popular narrative.
It really does. It's wild. Our focus today tracks this massive institutional arc. We're going to look at how a quiet government biologist and a river that supposedly caught on fire forced the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency.
A truly defining American origin story.
Totally. We're going to look at how that agency built its brain, the independent scientific apparatus that allowed it to survive corporate assaults and political pressure. And then we're leaning on some recent 2025 policy analyses from the Congressional Research Service and the Sabin Center to look at the modern dismantling of that very brain.
Right. We're going to examine the friction between the visceral, often inaccurate stories required to wake a sleeping public and the cold, unglamorous structural science required to actually protect them.
But to understand the stakes of 2025, we have to understand the baseline reality of 1960, right? We have to look at an era where the smoke pouring out of the engine wasn't seen as a warning sign at all.
Oh, completely. In the 1950s and early 60s, that smoke was literally the smell of progress.
Yeah.
You really have to suspend your modern sensibilities to understand the cultural mindset of post-World War II America. I mean, this was a period of unprecedented explosive industrialization. If a steel mill was belching thick, particulate-laden smog into the sky, or a textile plant was discharging vibrant, unnatural colors into a local river, the primary public reaction wasn't horror.
It was pride, almost.
It was economic relief. It meant production was up. It meant the country was winning the post-war economic boom.
And central to that boom was this absolute unquestioning faith in the miracles of synthetic chemistry. We're talking specifically about compounds like DDT.
Right, the wonder chemical.
Yeah, and looking at the historical record, it is entirely understandable why the public revered this chemical. I mean, during the war, DDT was deployed aggressively across the Pacific Theater to control malaria-carrying mosquitoes.
It was a literal lifesaver.
It is objectively credited with saving hundreds of thousands of Allied lives. It was the hero chemical that won the war in the tropics.
And when you have a chemical that achieves that level of heroic status, you don't just put it on a shelf when the war ends.
No, you definitely don't.
You bring it home and you commercialize it on a staggering scale. The domestic application of DDT was practically a civic duty back then. The sources highlight that by the early 1960s, roughly 80 million pounds of DDT were being applied annually within the United States.
Wait, 80 million pounds just in the U.S.?
80 million pounds every single year. It was being carpet bombed across agricultural fields, fogged through suburban neighborhoods to kill mosquitoes, sprayed heavily over national forests. Kids used to run behind the fogger trucks in their neighborhoods like it was an ice cream truck.
Oh man, that is such a crazy visual. It was just the ultimate modern convenience. But the danger of that convenience was completely invisible to the naked eye. And that brings us to Rachel Carson.
A fascinating figure.
What makes Carson such a, fascinating historical pivot point is that she wasn't some fringe radical throwing stones from the outside. She was deeply embedded inside the federal scientific apparatus.
Exactly.
She spent 15 years working as a marine biologist and eventually became the editor-in-chief of all publications for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
And that editorial position is crucial to understand. Because she was editing the publications, Carson was essentially the central clearinghouse for ecological data coming in from field biologists all across the country.
So she saw everything.
She saw the macro-level patterns that siloed researchers just couldn't see. She knew exactly how the government measured ecological health, and more importantly, she knew exactly what they were failing to measure. She recognized that the sheer volume of synthetic pesticides entering the environment was triggering this massive biological cascade that literally no existing regulatory framework was equipped to catch.
But Carson also understood a fundamental truth about human cognition, which I think is brilliant. When she sat down to write Silent Spring in 1962, she knew that dumping a barrage of molecular structures and lipid solubility statistics on the American public would achieve absolutely nothing.
Right, people's eyes just glaze over.
Exactly. So she engineered a heuristic. She opens the book with a chapter called A Fable for Tomorrow. She paints this vivid picture of an idyllic composite American town. The orchards are blooming, the streams are clear. But then a strange blight creeps over the area. And when spring arrives, it is totally silent. The robins, the meadowlarks, the doves, they're all dead.
It was an eerie chemical silence, and it was a brilliant communicative device, because it took a highly abstract, invisible threat and rendered it deeply visceral. But, it did, and honestly still does, ignite a massive debate within the scientific community regarding the ethics of communication.
Oh, really? Like a pushback on her methods?
Yeah. When you are dealing with complex data, is it a violation of scientific objectivity to deploy emotional fables? Is writing a haunting story about a silent spring cross the line from education into manipulation?
That's the eternal tension in science communication right there. But think about it like this. Think about how a world-class oncologist delivers a grim diagnosis. If they just walk in and hand you a printout of your white blood cell counts and a genetic sequencing report, they haven't actually communicated the reality of your situation.
No, you wouldn't know what you were looking at.
Right. You need them to translate those numbers into a narrative. They have to tell you the story of what the next 6 months of your life are going to look like if you refuse treatment. That narrative isn't a manipulation of the data, it's the necessary translation of the data into human consequence.
That's a really good analogy.
Carson was taking the deeply complex mechanics of biomagnification and translating it into a language the amygdala could understand.
And we should clarify, the actual underlying mechanics of that biomagnification were rigorously documented. Carson wasn't just making things up. She was pointing out the fatal flaw in the agricultural assumption of the era.
Which was what, exactly?
The assumption was that you spray DDT, it kills the boll weevil or the mosquito, and then it simply dissipates into the environment, goes away. But Carson's compilation of data proved that these synthetic chlorinated hydrocarbons don't dissipate. They are incredibly persistent, and crucially, they are fat-soluble.
Which means they don't just wash out of an organism's system, they get locked into the biological tissue.
Exactly.
And this is where the trophic ladder turns a small exposure into an existential threat. So the chemical enters the watershed. Microscopic zooplankton absorb these tiny trace amounts. Then small bait fish consume thousands of those plankton, storing all that accumulated DDT in their own fat.
Just keeps building up.
Right. Larger predatory fish consume hundreds of those bait fish. By the time you reach an apex predator, the concentration of the chemical is astronomical compared to the surrounding water.
The chemical biomagnifies at every step up the food chain. Carson specifically highlighted the terrifying effects of these concentrated DDT metabolites on apex bird species, particularly the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon.
And what was it actually doing to the birds?
The accumulated toxins actively interfered with the birds' calcium metabolism.
Oh, wow. So it affected their bones.
More specifically, their eggs. The eggshells simply couldn't calcify properly.
That is heartbreaking.
It really is. The eagles would go through their mating rituals, build these massive nests, lay their eggs, but the shells were tragically thin. The moment the parent bird settled onto the egg to incubate it, the structural integrity would fail. The egg would just crush under the parent's weight, killing the embryo.
Wow.
It was a silent, slow-motion, localized extinction. The birds were flying around, They looked healthy to the casual observer, but they were biologically incapable of reproducing.
And when Carson published this reality in 1962, the chemical industry reacted with, well, the fury of an enterprise facing an existential financial threat.
Oh, they went nuclear.
Yeah, the major manufacturers, companies like Velsicol Chemical Corporation, they launched a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar smear campaign. They didn't just attack her data, they attacked her character.
It got very personal.
They labeled her hysterical, unscientific, and even suggested she was a communist sympathizer trying to undermine American agricultural dominance.
But the ferocity of their counterattack actually backfired and ultimately secured Carson's legacy, because the controversy reached the absolute highest levels of government. President John F. Kennedy directed his Science Advisory Committee to investigate Carson's claims.
And what did they find?
In 1963, that committee released a report that thoroughly vindicated her research. The government's own top scientists concerned that the uncontrolled use of toxic chemicals posed a massive systemic hazard.
Tragically, though, Carson didn't live to see the structural changes her work set in motion. She died of breast cancer in 1964 at the age of 56.
Such a huge loss.
Yeah, but she provided the narrative vocabulary for the environmental movement. She proved that human industry could inadvertently unravel the biological fabric of the planet. But history shows us that a compelling narrative and a validated scientific theory are rarely enough to force emergency legislative action.
Sadly true. A narrative needs a poster child.
Right. It needs an image that is so profoundly shocking that it bypasses the analytical brain entirely.
It requires a visceral violation of the natural order.
Which brings us to the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, June 22, 1969. The popular mythology of this event is practically hardwired into the American consciousness.
It really is. It's iconic.
The story goes that the river was so choked with industrial sludge, oil, and chemical waste that a spark from a passing train hit the water, and the river itself erupted into apocalyptic flames. It's widely viewed as the singular, terrifying wake-up call that birthed the modern environmental movement.
But when you actually dig into the historical record, like Jonathan H. Adler did in his research for the Fordham Environmental Law Journal, the gap between the mythology and the reality of that specific June 1969 fire is astonishing.
It's wild. The historical record shows that the 1969 fire was almost a complete non-event. It was an anticlimax of epic proportions.
Right.
Adler's research points out that the blaze lasted maybe 30 minutes, caused around $50,000 in damage, primarily scorching some wooden railroad trestles. The Cleveland Fire Department arrived, extinguished it quickly, and moved on. It was such a routine, unremarkable event in an industrial city that the local press barely covered it.
And crucially, not a single photograph of the fire was ever taken.
Wait, not one?
Not one piece of visual evidence exists of the fire that supposedly changed the world.
That is insane.
And the reason no one rushed down to photograph it is that the Cuyahoga River burning was not a novel event at all. It was an industrial sacrifice zone. The river had caught fire in 1868, 1883, 1912, 1936.
So it was just a regular Tuesday in Cleveland.
Exactly. The truly devastating fire actually occurred in 1952. That blaze burned fiercely for 3 days, causing a massive $1.5 million in damage and requiring a massive mobilization to contain.
Okay, so the obvious glaring question here is this. If the 1969 fire was a 30-minute, unphotographed blip that the locals barely registered, how on earth did it become the defining, world-changing symbol of ecological collapse?
The answer lies in the mechanics of media and the power of displaced imagery. So a few months after the minor 1969 fire, Time magazine was preparing a major feature on a catastrophic degradation of America's waterways.
Right.
They decided to use the Cuyahoga River as their primary case study, mentioning the recent June fire as proof of the crisis. But the editors face a visual problem. They had a dramatic story, but zero photos of the event they were describing.
Because nobody took any.
Exactly. So they raided their own archives.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. They went into the archives and pulled the spectacular, terrifying photographs from the massive 1952 fire. These were images showing solid walls of flame reaching 5 stories into the air, engulfing tugboats with thick black smoke blotting out the sun. Time published those 1952 apocalyptic photos right alongside the text describing the 1969 fire.
And the general public, reading the magazine in waiting rooms and living rooms across the country, naturally conflated the text with the images.
They read about a fire happening right now, and they looked at a picture of an inferno from 17 years prior, and the myth was instantly forged. The outrage was immediate and overwhelming.
It is a masterclass in how political momentum is actually generated. We really have to ask why this specific, factually inaccurate amalgamation of image and text mobilized policy so much more effectively than Rachel Carson's meticulously accurate data on biomagnification.
Well, Carson's science was bulletproof, but it was complex. A river of fire is primal.
Think about the concept of a misleading movie trailer. You see a trailer for a psychological thriller, and it's cut together with pulse-pounding music, showing a character screaming, a car crashing, a massive explosion. It gets your heart racing, and you buy a ticket.
Right.
You sit in the theater, and it turns out the movie is actually a slow-burn, subtle character study. None of those explosive scenes from the trailer are even in the film. The footage in the trailer was fundamentally misleading, but it successfully got millions of people into the theater to witness the actual underlying story the director wanted to tell.
That is a highly accurate framework. The Time magazine spread was the misleading trailer for the American environmental crisis. The specific visual footage was historically inaccurate for the moment being described, but the underlying truth that the trailer was selling, the fact that the Cuyahoga River was profoundly toxically degraded, completely devoid of dissolved oxygen, and actively functioning as an open industrial sewer, was an undeniable, horrific reality.
The symbol was an illusion, but the crisis it illuminated was absolute fact. And I want you, listening right now, to consider how you navigate the modern digital landscape, how you process information today.
Oh, absolutely.
If a slightly out of context but incredibly emotionally resonant video goes viral on your feed, highlighting a complex geopolitical or environmental issue, you are far more likely to engage with that issue than if you were simply handed a dry 400-page policy white paper.
Without a doubt.
We are neurologically wired to respond to story and spectacle, not spreadsheets.
And in 1969, that visceral outrage over the burning river didn't just dissipate into a water cooler conversation. It was actively, strategically harnessed. The public fury was weaponized into what would become the largest single-day civic mobilization in American history.
We're talking about the genesis of Earth Day, April 22, 1970. And the architects of this mobilization were operating on pure political instinct.
Very sharp instinct.
Senator Gaylord Nelson, a Democrat from Wisconsin, had been closely observing the anti-Vietnam War movement. He saw the incredible efficacy of the teach-in model being used on college campuses, a decentralized grassroots strategy where students and faculty would take over lecture halls to educate themselves and organize protests against the war.
Nelson recognized that this exact same decentralized infrastructure could be pivoted to environmental awareness. He essentially crowdsourced a national movement.
Which was brilliant.
He announced a nationwide environmental teach-in and brought on a 25-year-old Harvard graduate student named Dennis Hayes to coordinate the logistics.
A 25-year-old was handed the reins of a national uprising. That's incredible.
Yeah, Hayes and his team targeted Wednesday, April 22, specifically because it fell perfectly in the middle of the week, maximizing the likelihood that college students would skip classes to participate.
But the scale of what actually materialized that Wednesday shattered every single expectation they had.
The archival data on Earth Day 1970 is genuinely staggering. 20 million Americans mobilized.
20 million. To put that in perspective, that was exactly 10% of the entire United States population at the time. 1 out of every 10 citizens took to the streets.
It's hard to even fathom that level of coordination before the internet.
It really is. And this wasn't a fringe movement of radical ecologists. This was a massive mainstream awakening. They shut down Fifth Avenue in New York City, turning it into a pedestrian walkway for hundreds of thousands of people. The National Mall in Washington, D.C. was completely flooded.
It spanned 2,000 college campuses and over 10,000 primary and secondary schools. It was a demographic tidal wave.
And sitting in the Oval Office, watching this massive display of civic power, was President Richard Nixon.
Now, to understand the creation of the EPA, we have to look very soberly at Nixon's motivations, because Nixon's own aides, including John Ehrlichman, have stated clearly on the historical record that Nixon had absolutely no personal passion for the environment.
Not at all.
None. He viewed the natural world purely through a transactional lens.
What fascinates me about Nixon here is that his deep cynicism actually resulted in something incredibly durable. He wasn't watching those 20 million people on Earth Day and worrying about the lung capacity of the American worker or the eggshells of the bald eagle. He was watching those crowds and worrying about Senator Edmund Muskie. He saw environmentalism as a powerful, emerging political weapon that the Democrats were preparing to use against him in the 1972 election.
Nixon was a ruthless pragmatist. His calculus was simple. If he took ownership of the environmental issue, he neutralized his political rivals. He didn't have to believe in the cause, he just had to co-opt the machinery of the cause.
And this reveals a profound truth about institutional architecture, doesn't it?
It does. Purely defensive, highly cynical political maneuvering can sometimes accidentally yield robust, fiercely capable regulatory structures.
So, to secure his political flank, Nixon takes massive unilateral action. On January 1st, 1970, he signs the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which fundamentally changed how the government operates by requiring environmental impact assessments for federal projects.
It's a huge deal.
And then he pulls the ultimate bureaucratic lever. On July 9th, 1970, he transmits Reorganization Plan No. 3 to Congress.
And Reorganization Plan No. 3 was the explicit blueprint for the Environmental Protection Agency. And due to the nature of executive reorganization authority at the time, it didn't require a grinding, complex legislative battle. It just required passive approval.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, if Congress didn't actively vote to block it within 60 days, it automatically became law. And because the deafening roar of 20 million voters was still echoing in the halls of the Capitol, neither the House nor the Senate dared touch it.
And so, whatever Nixon's actual internal motivations were, he inadvertently handed the American public an agency with unprecedented enforcement teeth. But actually building that agency was an operational nightmare.
Oh, total mess.
The EPA officially opens its doors on December 2nd, 1970. And reading the historical accounts of how it was assembled, it's like trying to build a fully operational aircraft carrier in the middle of a battle using parts cannibalized from a cruise ship, a fishing trawler, and a nuclear submarine.
It was the ultimate bureaucratic Frankenstein. The executive order mandated that the EPA be stitched together from 15 completely disparate, pre-existing units scattered across the entire federal landscape.
So they weren't starting from scratch.
No, not at all. They ripped the National Air Pollution Control Administration out of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. They took water quality divisions from the Department of the Interior. They grabbed radiation standard setting from the Atomic Energy Commission.
And arguably the most fiercely contested piece.
Yeah.
They took pesticide regulation away from the Department of Agriculture.
Which makes total sense when you analyze the conflicting mandates. The Department of Agriculture's primary objective has always been to maximize crop yields and protect farmers' economic interests.
Right.
If you leave the regulation of toxic pesticides inside the department, whose main goal is to boost production, you have an unresolvable conflict of interest.
They were regulating the very chemicals they were simultaneously promoting. Ripping that authority out of agriculture and placing it in a new unified environmental agency was essential. But it meant that on day one, the newly formed EPA was an incredibly volatile mix of warring bureaucratic cultures.
You had 5,800 transferred employees scattered across 183 different buildings trying to figure out who they reported to, armed with a $1.4 billion budget.
Total chaos. To manage this chaos, the administration taps a 38-year-old lawyer from the Department of Justice named William Ruckelshaus to be the first EPA administrator.
Ruckelshaus doesn't hold a PhD in biochemistry. He's an ecologist. But he possesses something vastly more important for a day one administrator.
Which is?
He understands the mechanics of institutional power. He knows that every massive corporation and every municipal government in America is looking at this disorganized, stitched-together agency and assuming it's a paper tiger.
They assumed the EPA would just be bogged down in internal turf wars and remain just as passive and fragmented as the 15 legacy bureaus it replaced.
Exactly. Ruckelshaus knew that his most critical immediate task was not writing scientific white papers. It was establishing raw, aggressive credibility. He had to prove that the paper tiger had teeth.
So within his first week on the job, Ruckelshaus starts throwing legal haymakers. He doesn't target the massive chemical conglomerates right away. He targets municipalities.
Smart.
He files massive enforcement actions against major cities, Atlanta, Detroit, Cleveland, demanding that they immediately halt the egregious discharge of raw sewage into local waterways in violation of existing, previously ignored statutes.
It was an incredibly savvy tactical move. Suing major municipal mayors guarantees front-page headlines across the country. It signals to the heavy industries that if the EPA is willing to take down a powerful city government, they will absolutely come for a steel mill next.
But Ruckelshaus was too smart a lawyer to believe that splashy PR lawsuits could sustain the agency long term. Dragging a city into court over raw sewage is relatively straightforward. The water is brown, right? But writing enduring regulations that dictate exactly how many parts per billion of a highly complex synthetic solvent a billion-dollar petroleum company is allowed to emit, that requires armor. Because the moment you issue that regulation, an army of highly paid corporate appellate lawyers will drag the EPA into federal court.
And the standard of review in federal court is brutal. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, a judge will strike down any agency rule that is deemed arbitrary and capricious.
So you can't just act on vibes.
Definitely not. If Ruckelshaus walked into a federal courtroom and said, hey, we need to ban this chemical because Rachel Carson wrote a very moving book and 20 million people marched on Earth Day, the judge would laugh the EPA out of court. A federal judge demands an evidentiary record. They demand the receipts.
And this brings us to the absolute core of our deep dive. To generate those receipts, Ruckelshaus needed an epistemological engine. He needed the Office of Research and Development, the OAO.
The brain.
Yes, the brain. The dossier we're referencing explicitly states a principle that dictates everything that follows. Regulation without independent measurement is politics. If you can't measure the invisible, your regulations are nothing but political preference.
The ORD was established simultaneously with the broader agency in 1970. And just like the broader agency, its creation required a massive, painful consolidation. The EPA had inherited 42 completely separate, highly specialized legacy laboratories.
Wow.
Over the first few years, the ORD underwent a brutal reorganization, eventually fusing those 42 chaotic units into roughly 10 major national laboratories, staffed by an elite cadre of around 1,500 scientists, toxicologists, and research engineers.
We really have to look at the exact mechanics of how these 1,500 scientists actually provided the armor for the agency, because their work is intensely technical, incredibly tedious, and entirely invisible to the public.
But it is the very foundation of environmental law.
Exactly. When we talk about creating standard detection limits, we are talking about the technological capability to legally prove a contaminant exists.
Right. Let's say in the 1960s, scientific instrumentation might only be able to reliably detect a chemical at parts per million. If a toxin is deadly at parts per billion, but your equipment can only see parts per million, then legally speaking, that toxin does not exist in the water.
Wow. If you can't see it, you can't sue for it.
Exactly. The ORD scientists were tasked with constantly pushing the boundaries of mass spectrometry and chromatography to create standardized, legally defensible methods for detecting contaminants at increasingly microscopic levels.
Because establishing that baseline capability is the only thing that holds up against a corporate lawyer demanding proof of emission. But detection is only half the battle, right? Once you prove the chemical is in the water, you have to legally prove it is causing harm.
And that requires building a dose-response curve.
How exactly does a dose-response curve work?
The dose-response curve is the ultimate shield. It is a rigorously plotted graph that correlates the exact concentration of a chemical exposure with the precise severity of the biological effect. It is the data that proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that exposure to chemical X at 10 parts per billion will result in a 20% increase in localized liver toxicity over a 5-year period.
Okay, so it connects the cause and the effect with hard numbers.
Yes. You cannot set a national ambient air quality standard or dictate a maximum contaminant level for drinking water without a bulletproof dose-response curve.
It's the math that translates the fable into a federal mandate. And to see the absolute necessity of this ORD data in action, we just have to look at the climax of the DDT story. In 1971, Ruckelshaus targets the king of pesticides. He initiates the process to cancel all federal registrations for DDT.
The blowback from the agricultural industry was apocalyptic. They testified that banning DDT would result in the total collapse of American agricultural yields. They predicted mass starvation and economic ruin.
They played every card they had.
They mobilized every lobbying asset they had to crush the EPA's initiative.
To counter that, Ruckelshaus couldn't and didn't rely on Earth Day momentum. He convened massive, grueling administrative hearings. For 7 months, hearing examiners waded through over 9,000 pages of testimony and technical records.
And the core of the EPA's case wasn't emotion. It was the overwhelming, structurally sound data generated and compiled by the ORD and its legacy components.
The scientists brought the receipts?
They did. The EPA presented the mass spectrometry readings. They presented the rigorously documented trophic-level bioaccumulation models. They presented the specific, peer-reviewed mechanisms of calcium metabolism disruption in avian species. They buried the industry's economic threats under a mountain of undeniable biological and chemical reality.
On June 14, 1972, armed with that exact data, Ruckelshaus issued the final order banning the domestic application of DDT. The emotion started the engine, sure, but the independent scientific record steered the car.
And the ecological response to that data-driven policy was miraculous. In 1963, the bald eagle population in the lower 48 states had crashed to roughly 450 breeding pairs. They were staring down the barrel of extinction.
Just 450, that is terrifyingly low.
Very low. But following the ban, the ecosystem slowly purged the metabolites. By the late 1990s, the bald eagle population had recovered into the thousands. The peregrine falcons and the brown pelicans tracked the exact same recovery curve.
It remains one of the most stunning, quantifiable validations of independent scientific regulation in modern history. But it is crucial to understand that Ruckelshaus didn't just build the ORD to protect the EPA from external industry attacks. He specifically engineered the structural independence of the ORD to protect the EPA from internal executive branch interference.
The threat coming from inside the house.
Exactly. And Ruckelshaus understood that threat intimately because he would eventually become the central figure in one of the most notorious examples of executive overreach in American history. We have to fast forward briefly to October 20th, 1973, the Saturday Night Massacre.
Right. By late 1973, Ruckelshaus had moved on from the EPA and was serving as the Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice. The Watergate scandal was metastasizing, and the independent special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, was demanding President Nixon's secret audio tapes.
Nixon was feeling the heat.
Nixon, desperate to survive, orders his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refuses to execute an unethical order and resigns.
So the directive to fire the prosecutor falls to the next man in the chain of command, which is William Ruckelshaus. Nixon directly orders him to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus looks at the staggering constitutional crisis, recognizes the profound violation of independent justice, and he, too, refuses to execute the order.
And for that refusal, Nixon instantly fires him.
Ruckelshaus literally sacrificed his career to maintain the structural integrity of an independent investigation. But that harrowing experience deeply informed his philosophy on government architecture.
He realized that a regulatory agency cannot function if its integrity relies solely on the rare, self-sacrificing courage of its political appointees.
He knew that eventually a president was going to pressure an EPA administrator to approve a dangerous chemical for a donor or bury a climate report to protect an industry. If the science wasn't structurally independent, the administrator would either have to cave to the pressure or get fired for refusing.
Exactly. Ruckelshaus built the ORD so that the science was firewalled. The political appointee could simply point to the legally mandated lab data and say, "My hands are tied. The scientists have established the dose-response curve, and I cannot legally ignore it."
He embedded the courage into the organizational chart, precisely so the agency wouldn't constantly require a martyr to enforce the law.
The independence was the architecture.
So having mapped out this incredible, intricate foundation built in the 1970s, an agency birthed by public outrage but heavily armored by fiercely independent structural science, we now have to look at the present day. We are jumping 55 years forward, examining the exact same architecture as it exists today.
We're looking at the organizational shifts announced on July 18, 2025.
And as we dig into this, I want to be very clear. Let's look at the 2025 Sabin Center analysis and the Congressional Research Service reports strictly through the lens of organizational design and institutional capability. We are just impartially reporting the facts laid out in these sources.
Right, maintaining strict neutrality here. The facts on the ground are stark. On July 18, the EPA announced a massive restructuring that effectively abolishes the Office of Research and Development.
The brain.
The brain that Ruckelshaus stitched together. The network of laboratories responsible for those crucial detection limits and bioaccumulation models is being dismantled. According to the official restructuring documents, the ORD is being replaced by a newly configured entity titled the Office of Applied Science and Environmental Solutions.
And the physical contraction associated with this shift is massive. The Sabin Center tracks that this reorganization includes the elimination of over 3,700 staff positions across the agency, which is projected to generate roughly $750 million in cost savings.
To understand how this is being received internally, the dossier quotes Justin Chen, the president of the AFGE union representing EPA employees. Chen publicly described the ORD as the heart and brain of the EPA, signaling a profound internal alarm regarding the loss of institutional memory and capability.
From a purely analytical standpoint, You can view this shift through two entirely divergent operational lenses. The proponents of the reorganization can point to the $750 million in savings as a massive fiscal victory, streamlining a sprawling, deeply entrenched bureaucracy.
Yeah, and furthermore, shifting the nomenclature from research and development to applied science and environmental solutions implies a pivot toward immediate industry cooperative remediation rather than funding endless long-term academic studies that might hinder economic development.
That is the argument for efficiency. But if we evaluate this through the historical framework we just spent the last hour building, the critics' concerns become incredibly acute. The argument against this dismantling is that it fundamentally alters the DNA of the agency.
By breaking apart the independent research apparatus and pivoting toward applied solutions, critics argue you are effectively stripping away the structural independence that Ruckelshaus deliberately designed. You are removing the firewall that insulates the regulatory baseline from political and economic pressure.
The contrast between the two eras is mathematically perfect. In 1970, a Republican executive branch looked at the staggering complexity of environmental degradation and actively expanded the federal scientific apparatus to meet the crisis.
They consolidated 42 labs, funded 1,500 scientists, and built a massive centralized data gathering engine.
In 2025, the exact same executive authority is executing a profound contraction. It represents a fundamental philosophical shift in how the state views its responsibility to measure the natural world.
Which forces us to look at the deeply unsettling implications for the future of environmental law. If the methodology vanishes, if you no longer have an insulated, robustly funded network of federal scientists establishing standard detection limits or plotting complex dose-response curves for novel synthetic chemicals, how do you legally define pollution?
You don't. Without the scientific baseline, the legal definitions become entirely subjective and endlessly malleable. Imagine a scenario where a massive chemical conglomerate introduces a highly profitable, entirely new synthetic solvent into the market.
Okay.
If the newly configured Office of Applied Solutions decides, for fiscal or political reasons, not to fund the rigorous long-term research required to build a dose-response curve for that specific solvent, then legally speaking, the hazard does not exist.
Because in a federal courtroom, the absence of data is the absence of liability. If the labs that generate the receipts are hollowed out, the chemical companies never have to fear the EPA walking into court with bulletproof evidence. As you pointed out earlier, you simply cannot regulate what you refuse to measure.
The dossier poses a philosophical question regarding this exact scenario that is incredibly haunting. It asks, when no one is measuring, can a thing be said to be dying?
Oh, wow. It is the ultimate regulatory application of the tree falling in an empty forest. If an ecosystem collapses but the federal monitoring stations have been dismantled, does it trigger a legal intervention?
Right.
The tragedy of the pre-1970 era, the era of the 80 million pounds of DDT in the constantly burning Cuyahoga River, wasn't just the sheer volume of the pollution. It was the total systemic institutional blindness to the consequences. They weren't measuring the eggshells, so the extinction was legally invisible. It is a profound historical cycle. We started today navigating that pitch-black highway, driving an industrial machine operating purely on the momentum of post-war chemistry, completely blind to the silent destruction accumulating in the food chain.
We saw how it required the profound emotional resonance of a storyteller, Rachel Carson translating the complex lipid solubility of toxins into a haunting fable to make the invisible threat visceral to the public.
We tracked how a factually minor 30-minute fire on an industrial river in 1969 was conflated with terrifying archival photos from 1952 to forge an outrage so powerful it mobilized 20 million citizens.
It was a potent, necessary illusion that forced a cynical political establishment to build a massive, complex regulatory machine out of 15 warring federal departments. But the ultimate takeaway from the archives is that the illusion didn't save the eagles.
The protest didn't ban the DDT.
It was the tedious, rigorously defended, fiercely independent data compiled by the scientists of the ORD that actually survived the crucible of the federal courts.
Emotion is the spark that ignites the engine of political change. But independent, heavily fortified structural science is the steering column that keeps the vehicle from veering off the cliff when the political winds change direction.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I really want you to consider how you process the constant barrage of information in the modern world. Where do you place your ultimate trust? Do you trust the evocative, terrifying stories that move your heart to action, or do you demand the unglamorous, complex spreadsheets that prove those stories are objectively true?
As the history of the EPA clearly demonstrates, the poet and the lab technician, are inextricably codependent. You need the visionary to point at the silent spring and scream fire, but you absolutely require the scientist to write the legal standard that puts the fire out.
And that tension leaves us with a critical, incredibly urgent question to consider regarding the realities of 2025. This is something to mull over after we sign off. If the structural independent science of the EPA is permanently dismantled, if we rip the dashboard out of the car to save money on wiring, will we inevitably become completely blind to the slow, invisible accumulation of the next generation of toxins?
It's a huge unknown.
And if we do successfully blind ourselves again, what is it going to take to wake us back up? Will it require an entirely new, deeply catastrophic public symbol, a new, undeniable burning river in the 21st century, just to generate the political willpower required to rebuild the exact same scientific institutions we are currently tearing down?
It's the terrifying prospect of having to wait for the engine to physically detonate before you finally admit you need a mechanic.
Exactly. We deeply appreciate you joining us to explore this massive, complex historical arc today. Keep questioning the balance between the stories we are told and the data we can legally prove. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.